Hello everybody, this is WarriorDan, and welcome back to another episode of Is It Worth It? And today we're taking a look at Remnant From The Ashes. Remnant From The Ashes is a third-person looter shooter, where the player starts out in an apocalyptic world, has no idea why the world is apocalyptic, and departs on a quest to uncover the truth behind it all, and potentially find some way to right the scales and fix everything. Kind of your generic end-of-the-world plot, but nothing wrong with that. Along the way, you encounter a small group of AI allies, including a doctor and a mechanic, who, aside from agreeing to provide you medical supplies and weapon upgrades, also supply you with a ton of lore, probably more than you'd ever actually care to know. If any or all of this sounds familiar to you, I congratulate you on your conscious or unconscious awareness of literally any of the Fallout games, most notably Fallout New Vegas. After doing a capture and defend type quest on behalf of District 13, where you attempt to hold off monsters from attacking this power generator thing you and a friendly AI are attempting to turn on, the Rebel Alliance gives you a starting weapon set and gear, and you unlock access to this portal thing that allows you to jump into the actual world and really start your monster hunting career. Normally I wouldn't be this flippant when describing the story and lore of a game, as storytelling in many games, especially in single-player games, can often be a very valuable asset, and often, although not always, can be used as a fairly strong metric by which to critique the quality of the game at large. However, this is only a rule of thumb and not an absolute concrete principle, as Remnant proves. While there is a tedious, often mind-numbing degree of exposition and lore building, a lot of it amounts to nothing. No real basis for emotional investment. Talking about emotional investment, let's talk about the character creation bit for a moment. You'll be presented with a decent, although not necessarily extensive, number of customization options. The degree of variety is acceptable but fairly unremarkable compared to most other RPG games of a similar budget and scale. If you're looking for a character creation kit to really play with at length in order to shape your ideal hunter, you're going to have to look elsewhere because you simply won't find it here. Where the game really sticks out is its gameplay, so let's talk about that. The best way I can describe Remnant's gameplay is derivatively creative. Kind of an oxymoron, but it's true. At its core, it encompasses many mechanics and concepts from a variety of sources. Others have made the easy comparison to the Dark Souls series, citing the fairly high learning curve, the challenging boss fights, and similar visual aesthetic in regards to enemy character models. I've seen others compare the environmental art for the above-ground city sections to The Last of Us, and of course the campfires. Because God forbid any game aside from Dark Souls use campfires as resting spots, and God forbid enemies respawning upon you saving and subsequently restarting the game. It's not like we didn't have to deal with any of that in older games. Also, of course, the idea of randomized dungeons filled with likewise random enemy encounters, and also random boss spawning points, can be traced all the way back to the 70s, courtesy of Dungeons & Dragons. I'm being snarky here, but my point is thus. I and most people, I think, don't have much of a problem with developers and other entertainers taking from pre-established work, as long as the intent is not only to duplicate those concepts and ideas, but to use them as the foundations upon which to construct something inherently new and different from what came before. Netflix's Stranger Things series brazenly steals from D&D for its entire overarching story and its rogues gallery of extra-dimensional villains, and it makes absolutely zero attempts to hide or deny the connection. And yet you don't see people whining at Netflix over the D&D connection there. I'm an absolutely dreadful Dark Souls player. I've tried playing the third one fairly recently when I got it as part of a Humble Bundle deal, and I never got past the second boss. It's just not my cup of tea. I'm terrible at it, and I have no desire to force myself to get better. It's not a playstyle that appeals to me. But here in Remnant, while there are some bosses that require a few retries in order to begin isolating their weaknesses, the learning curve and difficulty spikes are nowhere near comparison to even the easiest Dark Souls bosses. I've so far played hours on my own without any multiplayer co-op, and so far the biggest danger I've faced is not any one particular boss, but the endless waves of minions they spawn around them. If you have a second player who can just focus on distracting the lesser enemy bots, you can probably take out the boss itself without too much undue difficulty. The Dark Souls comparison, as mentioned before, is not really all that applicable. Aside from the visual stylings favoring dark, semi-gothic environments mixed in with a few post-apocalyptic intercity areas, which goes out of its way to invoke The Last of Us, and the ability to save game being inherently only accessible at in-game campsites, there's not a whole lot of overlap between Dark Souls and Remnant. On a related note, one aspect of the game I found interesting was the labyrinth sequences, where you're basically exploring different worlds and dimensions outside of your own, guided loosely by this robotic-like priest who sounds a bit like Hal from 2001: A Space Odyssey. The change in color palette is definitely appreciated. It's always good to have a bit of visual variety for different levels or map areas. These more futuristic areas definitely give off a bit of a Destiny-inspired vibe, especially in the way the world kind of slowly constructs around you as you move around it, all the while never really fully becoming defined. But aside from the change in environment, one of the most welcome features you begin to see at this point in the game is some additional enemy variety. At one point I ran across this primitive animalistic race that tended to favor likewise primitive weaponry. Instead of packing laser guns, you have to contend with normal enemies, throwing spears, as well as occasionally confronting elite bruiser-type enemies that try to charge you down and shred you to pieces with their Wolverine-inspired claws. They're a bit of a pain in the ass. Now let's talk about the combat. Bosses usually have a predetermined combat style, with some being evasive and preferring long-range attacks, and others who prefer keeping you within arm's reach. You'll always have to adapt to the unique behavior of each boss. In any boss fight, one of your most common tactics should be dodging incoming enemy attacks. Remnant can be very unforgiving, if not outright unplayable, for those electing not to make dodging part of their combat routine. That said, if a player becomes injured during combat, you can use certain potions and remedies that can apply a number of beneficial effects, including immediate health recovery, healing over time, a temporary damage output buff, etc. The biggest problem here is the painfully long casting time for these items. To use any of the potions, your character will need to spend several seconds applying it before the potion takes effect. The amount of times I've died mid-battle due to the healing animation, or killed from similar BS, is frustratingly high. There are many moments when you think to yourself, how is this even fair? But then you replay it and just hope that the same type of BS doesn't strike twice. This is a game that requires some modicum of skill, something that game journalists tend to lack, thus leading them to invoke the all-too-common Dark Souls comparison. After all, if it can't be played on easy mode, clearly it's Dark Souls. Idiots. Remnant incorporates a simple but effective leveling system, wherein you can choose to upgrade a handful of individual passive skills, represented via on-screen cards. These include maximum health increases, maximum stamina increases, and mod power regeneration rate increases. You can pick up more additional ones over time as you go. At the current point in the game I have about 5 or 6 I believe, but I believe you can get even more. Speaking of, let's talk about mods. You can equip your weapons with unique active or passive abilities, such as in my case, my shotgun has an active health regeneration over time ability that I can activate using a hotkey, and my pistol has a passive combat ability that grants a chance for certain bullets to also gain a burning effect, dealing bonus damage on impact and some additional damage over time for a set duration of time. Customizing your weapons through your choice of mods will have a small but noticeable effect on gameplay, and in some instances may make all the difference between life and death. Remnant is a game clearly designed around the old school principle of grinding and dungeon crawling. No two playthroughs will be entirely similar. Enemy spawn points, dungeon size and layout, and even the environment type may change greatly should you at any point decide to either start a new game or use the in-game reroll system, which allows you to transfer over your character's current progression and loadout into an entirely new randomized world. Personally, I had and continue to have a phenomenal time playing Remnant on and off as a pick up and play game. I prefer to try out my time with the game, a half hour here, half hour there, but that's just my playstyle with it. As of the time of recording, I've currently spent about 6 or 7 hours in game, and honestly, I'm looking forward to spending several more. When it comes to measuring cost versus value, it's not an exact art, but for most standard AA or AAA scale games, I tend to value my time at about $5 an hour. If a game like Remnant sets its retail price to $40, the first concern in my mind is whether I feel I can get at least 8 hours, more or less, of value from it before potentially getting bored and moving on. Some other people's standards might be different, largely depending on how much disposable income you can afford to be spending on games. But this is only a rule of thumb I play by, and it's a test that Remnant more than easily passes. It's not a perfect game, not that there ever really is such a thing, but by the standards of most action RPGs, Remnant is definitely one of the best standout titles of this year, and I have no regrets about buying it, and likewise I definitely recommend giving it a go if you're into action RPG games with a little D&D retro twist. Also, as an aside, prior to launch, the developers promised that they would continue to support the game post-launch with free updates and support, and they've so far done a remarkably good job of honoring their word. They just recently announced the upcoming edition of whole new game mode options, brand new in-game content, and they've been consistently updating the game with new bug fixes and other general improvements. In an age where gamers are used to being milked every day over loot boxes, DLC season passes, and other such nonsense, the fact that any one developer is willing to sell their game upfront at only $40 USD and not even try to upsell players with oppressive microtransactions is a very welcome sight indeed. At any rate, that's where I'm going to wrap it up for today. Hope you enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more review videos like this one in the future, be sure to give this video a like, and while you're at it, consider subscribing and hitting the bell icon so you can be among the first to know when a new video goes live, since YouTube's default subscriptions page is nowadays semi-broken at the best of times. This is WarriorDan signing out. Stay awesome everybody, and peace out.